With Daredevil often featuring alongside the super gritty Punisher, it's only natural that the Man Without Fear's storylines appear toned down and often cheery in comparison. But that's not entirely true. Matt Murdock's life is practically always in constant turmoil, and this has led writers to having to look outside the box in terms of what can be used to create that drama, even if it's something that's kind of weird and inappropriate to be casually used in a comic. Daredevil himself also serves to make a good amount of his storylines inappropriate as well, as despite his characterization as a moral hero, he does a whole lot of things that are entirely inappropriate for a good guy. With a history that involves trying to murder babies, committing identity fraud, and being the worst romantic partner ever, it's no real surprise that many of Daredevil's storylines can be considered inappropriate for a supposed superhero. So, with all that in mind, I'm Will for What Culture, back from telling myself that Daredevil's terrible 90s costume is canonically bad because he's blind and people are too polite to tell him it sucks, to bring you the 10 most inappropriate Daredevil storylines ever. Number 10, Daredevil's dad is stolen by mole people. Hearing the phrase Daredevil's dad is stolen by mole people initially sounds pretty funny, like a weird underground version of Taken. But the events that take place do so underground because Daredevil's father, Jack Murdock, is famously dead, and so the whole thing is a bit weirder than you'd think at first. While stolen family members are a reoccurring theme in comics, the theft of a dead parent has an entirely different spin to it. It doesn't cross a line per se, but it does breathe heavily on that line and expects you not to find it doing so in any way strange. Mole Man also dresses up the corpses he steals and dances around with them. It's super strange, and just a little bit mentally scarring. Number 9, Daredevil and Black Widow's relationship. Daredevil and Black Widow's relationship is, it's weird. Guys, it's weird, okay? Matt takes an interest in Natasha after his relationship with his initial love interest, Karen Page, goes south because of his superhero identity. The whole thing ends up characterizing Black Widow in some really uncharacteristic light, such as her weeping away when Matt takes an interest in another superhero, or refusing to live with her partner, preferring instead just to be homeless. Seriously though, the relationship may suffer from a little dramatic comic obligation syndrome, but it doesn't change the fact that half the stuff in the arc is weird as hell and has no business being there. Number 8, Karen's AIDS crisis. There are very few points in the entire Daredevil franchise as strikingly weird as when, in one 1999 comic, Mysterio, disguised as a doctor, convinces Matt's love interest, Karen Page, that she is HIV positive. Karen's entire character arc, from getting addicted to heroin and making adult movies to fund it, to finding God again and becoming a radio host, is pretty unconventional in the way it carries out. So while this does fit into the type of stories Karen is involved in, the idea of it being part of an evil scheme just doesn't make much sense. While it is admirable to want to draw attention to genuine issues people are facing and therefore take the stigma out of them, the whole thing feels more like a way to manufacture drama than actually address the topic of AIDS in a worthwhile manner. Number 7, Daredevil craves child murder. You'd be forgiven for immediately attempting to repress the fact that Daredevil did once genuinely attempt to murder a newborn child, but that doesn't change the fact that it canonically did happen. In yet another one of Mysterio's patented weird as possible schemes, the villain artificially inseminates a woman, waits until she gives the baby to Daredevil, and then disguises himself as a priest to convince the hero that the baby is the Antichrist and must be killed. Weirder yet, this plan works, with Daredevil even fighting Black Widow to be able to kill the infant. While at this point Mysterio has drugs Matt to confuse his morals, any situation where you're fighting one of the people you trust most for the rights to brutally kill a kid should trigger a few of the old warning sirens. The baby makes it out okay in the end, and Daredevil does come to his senses, but a little late, seeing as he comes around just after throwing the baby off a roof. Number 6, Daredevil commits identity fraud. Daredevil often has forms of identity crisis. After all, there was a brief period of time when he thought he was 7 different people. But by far the weirdest of these has to be the time he pretended to be his imaginary twin brother, Mike Murdock. Not only does Matt keep up this ruse with his nearest and dearest, despite how unsettling it is to see him lie to them for no reason at all, but he actually starts a relationship up with Karen as Mike, which is wrong on several different levels. Matt even considers proposing to Karen Karen as Mike, which is not only a horrible thing to do to the woman he's in love with, but would also be a crime, as at this point Mike would legally be considered an actual person, which he isn't. For a lawyer, Daredevil seems very unconcerned with the fact that he conspires for some time to commit major identity fraud or fake an identity to sleep with a woman he's into who isn't into him. Number 5. Spot's pregnancy crimes. Of Daredevil's roster of enemies, Spot, who can transport anything anywhere via the spots that live on his skin, was, at least for a long time, one of the least unnerving of them. In 2012, however, the writing team for Daredevil clearly thought that this was unfair, as they dedicated a whole arc to making Spot among one of the most genuinely unsettling comic book villains of all time. Spot is used to do a series of frankly horrific crimes, although perhaps the most questionable of these is the wormholes he uses to transport drugs through the bodies of pregnant women. It's pretty much physically impossible to read through the whole thing without getting pretty grossed out. It's not a bad comic in itself, but it's way over the line for the usual Daredevil shenanigans and then some. Read it if you want, but then try to forget it as much as you possibly can afterwards for your own brain. Number 4. Bullseye's Elektra preference. While the Daredevil End of Days spin-off is a decidedly dark-toned comic, it still contains moments that, because they're funny or because they're outright weird, or because of both, distract from that mood. The prime example of this lies within the investigation of Bullseye's death, which reveals that the prostitute that was with Bullseye while he killed himself was wearing an Elektra outfit that she tells investigators the supervillain brought with him. While Bullseye's death is, in theory, one of the darker parts of the comic, it is somewhat overshadowed by the newfound knowledge that he paid prostitutes to get down and dirty with the Elektra attire. Number 3. Daredevil ties up a naked child in the snow. While it's not especially surprising in concept that Daredevil once punished a guy who bullied Foggy by stripping him naked and leaving him tied up in the snow, it is something that's more than a little shocking to actually see on a comic page. These antics are carried out by a young Daredevil, sure, but they're still carried out by him. At no point does he consider that actually the whole thing seems more creepy and perverted than heroic. Weirder yet, when this unfortunate victim, Brad, finishes his ordeal, it totally changes him and convinces him to correct his entire personality and stop bullying people, because in comics, tying up and abusing naked kids gets results. Apparently. Number 2. Daredevil does human trafficking. Look, everybody has bad days, we get it. But when said bad days involve kidnapping random citizens who are enslaved to do terrible sacrilegious things, you may have gone a step further than most conventional bad days. This is very much the case with the Red Devil's experience in Daredevil number 311. Although it's partially justifiable in the sense that Daredevil has been mind controlled and is not in full control of himself, the comic does end with him using his willpower to break through the demon's control, leaving the implication that the hero could technically have done so way before enslaving all the innocent civilians, but saving them from enslavement wasn't a good enough reason to do so. Honestly, the whole Red Man series is a chapter in comics that pretty much everyone would like to forget. It's definitely one of Daredevil's least shining moments. Number 1. Daredevil blackmails a woman into marriage. After Matt becomes romantically involved with a woman named Heather, he endeavors to use his knowledge from crime fighting to blackmail her into marrying him, as otherwise he will reveal the secret illegal dealings her company is involved in. Not only is this a complete misuse of Matt's secret identity, it's also the single worst way to arrange a wedding of all time. The pair break up, but only because Foggy and Black Widow conspire to separate the two before Daredevil goes full-on villain mode on the poor woman. As if this isn't immoral enough, when Daredevil hears Heather call for help sometime later, Matt ignores her after learning she isn't in any physical danger. Heather, isolated without any loved ones to support her, then kills herself. It's super sad, way too dark, way out of line for Daredevil's character. He's meant to be the good guy, and I guess it reminds us all that sometimes being a superhero is just checking up on someone who seems to be struggling.